So welcome, everyone. I am so pleased to have two guests with us today for the conversation. Today we have with us Jeta Mulaj and Olaloku-Teriba. And so Dr. Jeta Mulaj is assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at Toronto Metropolitan University. She's the co-founder and executive director of the Balkan Society for Theory and Practice, an international research society based in Kosovo, as well as a research associate for the Society for Women of Ideas. Jeta's essays have been published in many journals, including Hypatia, Constellations, Philosophy Today, Continental Thought and Theory, and Feminist Critique. Annie Olaloku-Teriba is a Bonnard Trust scholar working on a doctorate in psychosocial studies at Birkbeck University. Annie is an editor at Salvage magazine, and she's the host of Salvage Live and Black as in Revolution. Her essays have appeared widely in outlets such as Al Jazeera, Frieze magazine, Novara Media, and Historical Materialism. Thank you both so much for being here today. I have great admiration for your work, so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And I just want to start by asking you both the question we ask all of our guests, which is just to give us a sense of your intellectual trajectory. Annie, do you want to go ahead and start?
Sure, absolutely. Okay, so hi everybody, nice to see you. So I kind of got started thinking around, well, I would say that the broad umbrella of my thought in general is thinking about ontology and the role that it plays in how we think about ourselves in the world. And that kind of emerged from my university days where I was looking. Well, it started in the movements and then moved into the academy. So I was involved in movements and increasingly frustrated by some of the blockages that we were experiencing, especially around concepts of political blackness, which became a hot topic in the UK around 2014, 2015. And I was involved in a series of movements around decolonizing the curriculum, also around Roads Must Fall. And out of that came the idea of my piece on anti-Blackness theory and Afro-Pessimism. And I actually put in my abstract in my final year, finished writing it the year after, but it took a long time. Anyone who's done peer review knows how long it takes to get things out. And from that, a number of kind of things, and I hope during the conversation we'll be able to get across how my kind of thinking around it has changed or nuanced itself over time. At the moment, I'm doing my PhD, and the title of my PhD is The New Black Atlantic. And what I'm looking at is labor migrancy after the Second World War and how the conception of Blackness in political movements tied to trends in labor and migration have moved us from a space where we think about Black as a proletarian category emerging from the anti-colonial movements and national liberation into thinking about Blackness as an ontological abstract category, which we kind of see more so in today's movements. Aside from that, I'm kind of thinking about ontology more broadly and preparing a paper actually, which I'm quite anxious about for a conference at AUB at the end of the year on Fanon and universalism and what that would mean today. And then finally, bigger branch is also thinking about Nigeria, which is my home country, around institutions and the subtle role that abstraction plays in how we think about development. So I've gotten more involved in kind of governance activities, and through that I've kind of realized how hollow the state is in terms of just like actual capacity to do things in a way that, you know, historically the productivist socialist state would, you know, use the state as a means of redistributing wealth. Today, the Nigerian state just does not have the capacity in the practical sense to do that. And so I've been doing a lot of research around Nigerian financial institutions, transition in the Nigerian economy through the neoliberal era. And that's the kind of stuff that gets me going. So if you go on my Twitter profile, that's what you'll see most. I'm building a project, I'll just kind of end on this note, called Curiosity Lab. And I'm trying to think about how I could import Marxist thinking into Nigerian society without naming it as such. But the idea is just to kind of spark a generation of people who think about the world in more curious ways, who ask more questions. I love the line from one of Stuart Hall's old speeches, I might bring it up later, where he says, Marxism is the questions that you ask, not the answers that you come to. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Annie. And I know that you have to maybe turn off your video for a minute, which is fine. Yeta, do you want, I'll turn it over to you to for the same question.
Yeah. First, thank you, Jennifer and Gabriel, so much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to the discussion. Very broadly, I work on social and political philosophy, critical theory, and Marxism. And my research interest is around the question of what is contemporary domination and how can we theorize emancipation with a kind of an eye to class, gender, sexuality, and more recently also to what's been, I guess, termed coloniality. My overall kind of research attempts to bring contemporary conversations that are focused, especially feminism and decolonial theory, that are focused on questions of behaviors, attitudes, and knowledge to questions of social relations and social conditions. So in a sense, using Marxist methodology, critique of analysis of class and critique of ideology to bring these methodologies to bear on contemporary debates. A lot of my kind of philosophical and political formation occurred when I was young. I grew up in Kosovo during the Balkan Wars, and Gabriel told me that there's a few participants from the Balkan regions here. So I grew up, during that time during the dissolution of Yugoslavia, and that had a really big impact on kind of how I think about the role of theory and praxis. And when I moved to the States, I was really disappointed in a sense to see that there are a lot of contemporary political theory has given up on the ideas of total transformation and is increasingly theorizing politics as constant and perpetual resistance as opposed to total transformation. So the book that I'm currently working on is a critique of this account of politics, which I call Politics of Disruption, which has given up again on the account of total revolution, total transformation, and at the same time has given up on what I call stability or any sense of lasting justice. So it can only theorize justice and society in terms of perpetual change, which seems to me to be, in a sense, an ideological representation of capitalist society or a projection of the movement of capitalism now at the level of theory. And out of this kind of large book project, I've been increasingly interested also in various ways in which contemporary theory, especially feminism and decolonial theory, are unable to provide emancipatory theory and praxis precisely because they lack, it seems to me, fundamentally a theory of capitalism. And so my work, on the one hand, kind of deals with this question as it pertains to feminism, and this was the Judith Butler piece that I think some of you read. And on the other hand, increasingly, I've been interested in decolonial theory and trying to figure out why is it the case that something like decolonial theory, which is so focused on the concept of Europe and the history of Europe, has systematically excluded Eastern Europe. So I'm trying to figure out, in a sense, and to theorize what is this exclusion doing for decolonial theory. And it seems to me that this exclusion allows, in a sense, decolonial theory to maintain a very old school account of Europe as homogeneous, all white, emptied of Muslim populations, at the same time continue to use a kind of an outdated East-West divide. And I think bringing Eastern Europe into the conversation complicates these basic fundamental premises of decolonial theory. So these are just, very broadly some of the work that I'm doing, but at the core of it is really an attempt to want to understand contemporary society and to think about ways in which we can theorize the negation of existing society as opposed to simply resist it in kind of meal-peace practices.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. So our initial idea to bring you two together for an event with a critical theory workshop stemmed from the way that you both have addressed the ontologizing tendencies in contemporary philosophy and social theory, as you both mentioned. And when I'm talking about ontologizing tendencies, I mean the tendency for theorists to reify as a trans-historical order of being what are, in fact, historical products and processes. So Jeta, this is something that you address in your critique of Judith Butler's theory of precariousness and precarity that was published in Constellations. Annie, you do this in your critique of Afro-Pessimism that was published in Historical Materialism, which we read. And it seems that this kind of tendency that you're both addressing in these distinct academic discourses is quite rampant in contemporary Western philosophy and social theory that rejects the premises of Marxism. Jeta, I know that you're working on decolonial theory, and this is another instance where we see the kind of collapsing of epistemology and ideology into ontology and these huge claims about ontological difference. I know Colin Bodales, who was also on this call, is somebody who's written about this as well. So I'd just like to start by asking you both to offer your evaluation of this ontologizing tendency in the US North Atlantic theory industry, and to talk about, what type of misapprehensions and political confusion results from the ahistorical and non-dialectical presuppositions and methods of the philosophies you critique. And I'd also like to invite you to offer your thoughts on the historical origins of this tendency. And I'd be especially curious to hear how you think it relates to the identity politics and culturalism that really characterize political culture in much of the imperial core. Jeta, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. That's a really important and big question. And I've been trying to think about this question a lot. And in part, I think giving a history of these ontologization tendencies is difficult, in part because I think they never went away fully. But I think there's perhaps like two ways, at least, that I've been thinking about the history. And one is through Heidegger, really the role of Heidegger in the history of philosophy. And I think Heidegger is an important figure, in a sense, to focus on, because his influence is really still so relevant, including in theories that are considered kind of anti-ontological and radical, such as Latinx feminism and Caribbean philosophy. And I have in mind here thinkers like Mariana Ortega, Maria Lugones, and Glissant, and which have really strong Heideggerian elements in their thinking. And I think what is interesting about someone like Heidegger and his influence in philosophy is that you have the kind of emergence of ontology, which happens in a specific time and place. However, it's an ontology that emerges in the scene but erases its own history. So all of a sudden, there is, in a sense, no distinction between ontology and the history of ontology, or being and the history of ontology. And this kind of ontologization, which erases its own history, is dangerous, and I think at times also difficult to discern, especially because it can integrate language like historicity that appears like we are in fact doing history, like someone like Heidegger. But you have a way in which history is replacing what we might call something like concrete history of capitalism, of domination, of struggles. And slowly, right, you have a pretense of doing history while at the same time particular struggles and forms of domination become excised from ontology, or they do not belong to philosophy proper or to ontology proper, so to speak. So I think, looking at the history of Heidegger and his continued influence in contemporary decolonial Caribbean and feminist philosophy is one way to think about this tendency. Another way to think about it, and this is kind of more particularly what my research is focused on, is to see how there's a lot of theories which have initially defined themselves as anti-ontological, only later to have ontology, in a sense, reappear. And I think Butler is a really good example of this, who made their career initially as a kind of feminist anti-ontological thinker, and slowly ontology creeped into their theory. And the reason why I think these particular theories that are defined, so to speak, as anti-ontological and yet are still ontological, why they're interesting, is because they purport to do a new kind of ontology that is not an old school ontology that theorizes a kind of an essence, but rather one that is supposed to be non-essentialist, so usually referred to as social ontology or socio-ontology. And when you look at, in a sense, what the social is doing in the social ontology, it's quite interesting. So someone like Butler will say, we're not trying to theorize fundamental structures of being, but rather to see how bodies are formed and affected. But then when you actually look at what this looks like in their actual theory, social ontology ends up just being ontology once again, with a caveat that the social, which historically used to be the other of ontology, has now been subsumed under ontology. So now to be social or the social becomes just a feature of being once again. So another way to put it is that it seems to me that these theories like Butler's reintroduce the social and the historical only to exclude it once again, right? Or to render it ontological as opposed to social and historical proper. And this is one of the ways also that we can begin to think about the difference between Butler and someone like Marx or the Marxist tradition, where the latter retain a kind of tension between society and nature and therefore can theorize the two together. Like, whether it is second nature or the dialectic between society and nature, versus someone like Butler, the two are collapsed, but in favor of nature or ontology. So in a sense, we lose the social or the ontological. And I think there is a lot of dangers of this, what Jennifer referred to as ahistorical non-dialectical method. And for the sake of time, I'll just briefly mention a few. It seems to me that, fundamentally, when features of capitalist society become masquerade as universal or are projected onto ontology, then the biggest problem is that we cannot at all theorize or analyze and critique these features themselves. So the misstep of treating phenomena such as, let's say, equality, which is what I discussed in the paper, as not a social form, but as an ontological truth, seems to me to trap theorists in a very society that they initially purport to critique. So once you elevate these social phenomena to a kind of ontological status and you sever them from capitalism, not only, again, can you not critique them, but also in the sense you create this false dichotomy in which these principles, which are in fact principles of society, appear now to be anti-capitalist principles that we can use to critique society. And so we lose the historical element, and we also lose the critical element. And when we look at, I think, thinkers like Butler and others who are turning to ontology, I think it's important to know that they're not merely providing an ontology and then a politics, but they're returning to ontology as a kind of source for social problems. So Butler does this when they make the claim that society ought to conform to ontology, that our ontology already has these political and social and ethical principles, and the only issue with society is that it doesn't conform to them, but it ought to conform to them. And this is a form of critique that is, again, very distinct from the Marxist tradition, which maybe we can talk about this a bit later, does not really begin to critique society on the basis of failing to realize its ideals, because it understands that ideals are themselves socially produced and historical. So I think fundamentally then the biggest issue with these ontologizing tendencies is that they remain trapped in the present and they're unable to critique the present, to theorize or provide an emancipatory theory and praxis because of these ontologizing tendencies. And just very briefly, I want to also address Jennifer's last point about identity politics, because it seems to me that there's a lot of connections between identity politics and ontologizing tendencies. And I know that people think about identity politics in all kinds of ways. So kind of just for the sake of clarity, I think about identity politics as a kind of theory that is grounded on the subject and endows the subject with particular special, in a sense, features or qualities. And I think here, theories like Butler's, and also for those of you that are familiar, Lugones, who provide an ontology of the fluid subject that by virtue of its fluidity can always resist, is an example of identity politics. And this is, again, I think, a good example because it both shows on one hand another form of this kind of ontologizing tendency in which you have a specific form of the individual, the fluid individual that is always mobile, that emerges historically with capitalism, that is being projected onto ontology, right? So we can make now the claim that all human beings are inherently fluid and always mobile. And at the same time, a subject that by virtue of this ontology can be posited as always resistant. And this seems to me to be a form of identity politics that is particularly dangerous insofar as it ontologizes liberation. It no longer looks outward at the objective conditions of society to see whether or not liberation is possible, but it renders it a feature of the subject. And by virtue of rendering it a feature of the subject, in a sense, it gives up on the possibility of liberation entirely. So yeah, so it seems to me that's like one way in which we can begin to think about identity politics, even though I think there's other features that it shares in common with these more broader ontological tendencies.
Thank you so much, Jeta. Annie, are you with us? Are you able to reply?
Yeah, I'm with you. I can start. I might move about a bit in the middle, but I can start. So are you okay for me to start?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. All right. So I guess when I think about this, my first kind of thought is to return to the question of what Marxism is. And I think for me, Marxism is the return to the question of what is to kind of begin to unpack the abstractions that mystify the processes that go on in society in order to produce oppression in the first place. And I think this kind of ties very neatly into my kind of arc for ontology in the neoliberal era. And I think this kind of comes in a moment where you get to the point of faith, where, you know, in the 60s and the 70s, it was very clear to people. People genuinely believed. I watched the other day a documentary of I watched the other day a documentary of a church recording in the 1970s, where people were singing songs of liberation, songs of struggle from the period of slavery, and you really got this palpable sense that people genuinely believed that they were going to win. And then you have the oil crisis, the recall of the loans, and all of a sudden, towards the end of the 1970s, it becomes, you know, increasingly the case that people see this project of national liberation, this project, this global emancipatory universalist project begin to crumble. And I think in that space, what we haven't yet done collectively as people who kind of think in emancipatory terms is come to terms with some of the transformations that have happened in capitalism since. And so because most people are approaching this question, I guess I differ slightly from Jeta in that I'm coming at this from a perspective of the weaknesses and even our Marxist theories of liberation, or our Marxist theories of the composition of capital today. And our inability to confront that has left us trying to fit a new set of dynamics into an old language. And I think that's really the root for me. And I think this is the case because historically, all of these tendencies have existed. If you think about, you know, the target of my essay, which was Afro-Pessimism, you can really draw quite a straight line between Afro-Pessimism of today and Black nationalist accounts of race and of Blackness in the 1960s, in the 1950s. But what changed? Why is it that, you know, where in the 1960s, by the end of the 60s, the Panthers and the radicalization of SNCC kind of comes to the fore as the dominant language in the imperial core for understanding oppression and domination, whereas today, that old tendency of race or Blackness in the past, or of race and Blackness as an ethnic fact. There's this language of ethnicity. We accept that there is no difference between people of different races. However, there is the biological fact of Blackness in the form of there's a biological fact of Blackness in the form of ethnicity that imports itself back in. And I think the reason for that is because where historically many of those people would have been drawn into a compelling account of why we are dominated, right? You have the account of Blackness as proletarianization, the Black in the colonial periphery is dominated in order to supplant them and take their land, and also dominated in order to extract the value from their labor, right? Today, as the ruling class looks increasingly multicultural and diverse, that language or articulation of race no longer appears as quite as compelling. And I think when I originally started writing my piece on Afro-Pessimism, one of the things that really struck me, I had a discussion with some people in the movement that I was involved in who I understood to be leftist, and who became quite frustrated with the presence of this category of people, non-Black people of color, in our movements, and the dominance of those people in our movement. Invariably, these people, there's a political economy to this, were largely middle-class Black people, and these people of color, non-Black people of color, were largely working class, but that's by the by. And I asked them, why is it that when we're talking about non-Black people of color, when we're talking about white people, it's very easy to find a language to explain the domination. But when we think about categories of Black people, or people who are defined by society as Black, or people who are defined by society as Black who dominate, celebrities, Black billionaires, Black political class in the global South, why did it suddenly become so difficult to understand those dynamics? And it's because our language is not capacious enough to hold that tension of the transformations that have happened in the class composition of Blackness itself. Now, I think there is a role that the kind of philosophical grounding of ontology has played in this, insofar as the separation of mind and body has created an avenue for that import. In Race as a Floating Signifier, Stuart Hall talks about how there are countless attempts to analyze race from a Marxist perspective, to rid race of that biological content, but that biological content in essence gets replaced by ontology. And the reason I think for that is because if you think about the structure of Afro-Pessimism, on the one hand, there is a claim to anti-essentializing, right? So they have that same historicity. They talk about, the role of the slave trade in social death and in the permanent dishonoring of the Black. But if you really kind of put that in context of the actual history of slavery, there's a particular category of people to whom they pay fidelity, and that's the African American. If you think about the dynamics, the role of people on the continent, or Africans, they weren't Africans yet, on the continent, and their participation in the slave trade, which is far more nuanced. In the essay, I talk about this experience I had going to the point of no return in Nigeria, and that really changed my life. And the way that slavery is historicized there is radically different to what we get in schools in the West. And it's understood as something that was perpetuated by people who have power onto people who don't. Whereas in the West, we understand it as something that was perpetuated by white people onto Black people or onto Africans. And I think that's really what created the opening. I don't think necessarily that the problem is the categories. I think that the problem is how we understand the formation of those categories. There was a really interesting talk that Hortense Spiller gives, where she's asked about this category of Black. And if you think about Blackness as a process or as a logic, all of a sudden you're not tied to the incoherence of understanding the slave trade and the role of Africans on the continent in it, alongside the historic experience of Jim Crow segregation in America, alongside the experience of colonialism as a coherent whole. In fact, these are different iterative events which aren't building on a category of Blackness, but actually making that category of Blackness. And I think that's what made possible in the 1960s and 1970s the possibility, the formulation of political Blackness in the British context. And that's really the starting point of my PhD, is to say that, okay, you have large numbers of people, especially from the Caribbean and South Asia, coming into the UK, who are sharing a set of experiences which are Blackening them. And in that shared experience, just like in Marx, right, the workers who sit together on the factory floor are able to identify with each other because of those shared experiences. And in sharing those experiences, you get the emergence of a conception of themselves as a collective whole, and the role that our capacity to choose our communities plays in our capacity to resist, but also to go from, there's a really beautiful in Huey Newton's thought distinction between resistance and revolution, right? So at the moment we're kind of stuck at the point of resistance, but to move from that resistance to revolution is to understand the act of creation. So resistance is the act of fighting against, or the act of seeking to destroy. Revolution is the act of creation, I think. And once you can understand the possibility of having multiple communities, overlapping communities, and the role and agency that we have in forming those communities, then I think the possibility of universalism becomes much closer to us. I think the challenge today is that because we think of Blackness as something that is, we think of race as something that is, and there's a role that the state plays in propagating that. And if you look at colonial Africa, especially colonial Southern Africa and West Africa, the role of the identity card, the role of ethnic categorization.
Oh, Annie, sorry, it was just hard. It's hard to hear you right now.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Is this any better?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. So in colonial Southern Africa, in colonial West Africa, British colonial West Africa, the role of categorization and the way that mediates your relationship to the state, and also kind of categorizes people into different forms of labor, played a significant role, and this is kind of building on Mamdani's work, plays a significant role in entrenching ethnic identity and in the creation of tribe as a transhistorical concept. And that really kind of makes it difficult for us today. Even, I'm working on the Nigerian context at the moment. The role of ethnicity in Nigerian politics and governance is really quite striking.
Oh, Annie, I didn't know if you cut off. Are you there? Oh, Annie, I think you're muted.
Okay, I'm going to pull all these pieces together. Sorry, because I've been a bit scattergun, but I just want to kind of give it a structure. So I think if you kind of go back to the old, I think, therefore I am. If we start with I am, stay cut. The problem of ontologizing is that you begin to think of individuals as purely the reduction of the structure of domination. Mm-hmm. And you fix them and freeze them in time. It's like whiteness is a pathogen. White people have essentially bad and oppositional interests to people of color. Non-Black people of color have essentially bad and oppositional interests. And I think that also kind of permeates a lot of feminist thinking in terms of feminism as the struggle to curtail or limit the capacity of men to act on essentially bad kind of interests or oppositional interests to women. But if you go back to the question of how that is made, how these categories come into being, then you begin to see that there's a lot of contingency, that these things weren't inevitable, that we aren't born, I'm going to sound a bit like MLK, but that we aren't born with essentially different interests, but actually that the social, which is typically treated as the interactions between people, is not interactions between people, but the structure in which those interactions happen. I think this is really Marx's big contribution to social theory, the notion of a social totality in which we exist. And so in Fanon's work, he talks about how those who think of such a thing as a Black culture or Negro culture are mistaken, because the conditions and the people who are able to bring it into being are losing their economic and political relevance. So the project of transformation isn't a project of transforming individual people, but the project of transforming the social totality in which those individual people are socialized. And I think that that conception from a place of dejection, from a place of a lack of understanding in terms of the transformations in capital, and I'm going to talk a bit more about this later on, has really kind of propelled a pretty nihilistic approach to politics. The idea that, you know, people are essentially desirous of oppression, even within our movements, right? If someone goes wrong, you know, it was always in them from the beginning, and they're just acting out on their race. You're being a white person. Then going back to the I think that's really why I made the move from history and politics, which I did for my undergraduate, into psychosocial studies. I think we don't appreciate the extent to which how we think about the world, and not just how we act in it, is shaped by the social totality. And that plays a role not just in our interactions, but also in our horizon of possibility. And if you think about what I said earlier in terms of how the worker experiences identification on the factory floor, there have been some concrete shifts in the composition of the working class, not just in the imperial core, but also in the developing world. The rise of the sweatshop and monopolistic kind of practices, meaning that people don't have enough time. They haven't, you know, in the 60s, we've worked with people for years. They'll get to know them, they'll know about them. And today, labor is so much more atomized that the possibility of that collective consciousness, the possibility of that identification has become harder and harder and harder. And so I don't think that there's like a bullet theory for why, or for individualism, or a bullet theory for ontology that's really kind of like cut through and shaped how everybody's thinking. I think it's limited how the left thinks, but at the same time, to kind of place the burden or the responsibility of the transformation that we've seen in political movements onto these theories is to make a mistake, because I think underneath this have been some really concrete shifts in the way that capital is composed, in the way that people are able to engage with each other, and the level of connectivity between people that has made it impossible to think other. Not impossible, but made it much more difficult to think otherwise. And so I think the work going forward is to find ways of understanding where capitalism is at the moment, in order to devise languages that fit this moment. For a long time, I got lots of hate because people thought talking about political blackness meant that I thought that political blackness should come back, or that I thought that that was an effective banner under which to organize today. But I don't think it is. I think that in a certain time and a moment, the conditions made it possible to think in those terms, but we live in a different one. So, yeah, lots of different places, but TLDR. TLDR. I think that ontology is rooted in our assumptions, and that the courage to challenge those assumptions is really where we begin to push forward. I'll leave it there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you both for those excellent responses. And so I'm going to ask one more question to have and ask you both to respond to it, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. And this is, you know, in some ways, this is something that you've both started to answer, but now that we've talked about some of the problems with these anti-dialectical ahistorical theories, I'd like to hear you talk about what dialectical and historical materialism offers for the analysis and transformation of the social world that cannot be achieved via these more metaphysical, non-dialectical accounts of history. And so basically, in short, I'd just like to hear you talk about how a Marxist methodology offers a distinct account of the social phenomena that you both are examining in your respective work. And also, if you could talk about in what ways this different analysis also lays the grounds for a distinct politics. Jeta, do you want to start?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that question, Jennifer. And kind of to follow some of the things that Annie said, I wanted to begin by saying, kind of noting what kind of Marx or Marxism I'm talking about. So when I talk about Marx, I generally mean Marx and his own writings, and also what is known as a new reading of Marx, And that's something we can talk about during the Q&A if you're interested, and how critical theory, especially for generation critical theorists, take up Marx. So when I talk about Marx and Marxism, I generally mean this strand of Marx that thinks about Marx and his methodology that is not centered on what we might call the realization of labor or the laborers, but rather the abolition of labor as it exists in capitalist society. And a kind of Marxism that thinks about the categories which we use to theorize capitalism and critique capitalism as not being strictly, let's put it, economic categories. And then on the other hand, we have other kinds of categories, but rather than the categories that Marx and this genre of Marxism is using, such as value, commodity, labor, are not just economic categories, they are what Marx called life forms, right? So it is about the form of society in general. And this gets me to what I think is one of the most important features of Marx, and that is his historical dimension. So I'm assuming if you ask any critical theorists today, they will say that they're historical, but what that exactly means can be quite different. So often it seems to me that when people, when theorists say that that their work is historical, they mean something like things change over time, or that things are always in a kind of perpetual state of becoming. I don't think Marx would disagree with that, but I think the kind of historical character of his theory is different. And is different in the sense that he begins his work by analyzing, first and foremost, what makes our society historically specific. What makes it different, let's say, from previous forms of society? How do we talk about it distinct from feudal society, from ancient society? So the kind of the historical character of his theory begins there. And I think this is important because, again, and I keep emphasizing this, but it means that he's proceeding with an understanding that we live in a capitalist society and that society has this particular form, and to be able to understand different phenomena that emerge in it, practices, theories, and critiques, this is the starting point, this is the context. So even his theory and critiques that we have of capitalist society, in a sense, are contextualized or made possible by this very society that we're critiquing. And that's something that theory, in a sense, has to take seriously and not ignore. And to say that the kind of historical thinker that Marx has to do with providing a theory of what makes capitalism historically specific, I think is also what sets him apart from contemporary theory. And just to give one example, think of someone like Butler, who, when they talk about capitalism, will generally talk about something like the unequal distribution of goods. The unequal distribution of goods is not particular to capitalism. You can talk about unequal distribution of goods in all forms of society. And when you contrast this with the kind of theoretical framework that Marx gives us, is one that is not based on unequal distribution of goods, again, which is not specific to capitalism, but the particular form of labor that occurs in capitalism and the kind of domination that comes about from that particular form of labor. So again, he's historically specific in that way, and I think that's a really important feature of Marx. And out of this account of capitalism, he also provides a form of critique, what we might call immanent critique, which I think also is incredibly useful for us and is very different from critiques that are predominant today. And one of the most important aspects of immanent critique, which I think is, again, really useful for us, and this is something that I mentioned earlier in the previous question, is that critique does not proceed from a distinction between ideals and reality. So it does not begin by saying, we have this ideal of equality that we love, reality does not match up to this, we ought to realize it more fully. And this, again, Butler is a good example of this, but they're definitely not the only one. And Marx, by contrast, understands ideals to be products of society. Therefore, critique does not proceed from those ideals, but rather it begins with unfolding the object of critique. So if the object of critique in this case for us is capitalism, then the role of the critic or the theorist is to be able to show what the movement of society is. And for Marx, a kind of movement that can point beyond itself. So to show its movement, to show its logic, to show its contradictions, and therefore, what are the ways in which the society in which we live produces certain possibilities and blocks their realization. So immanent critique, and here I'm really influenced by Moïse Poston's work. He puts it as immanent critique locates the ought that is immanent in the is. In other words, critique locates possibilities that capitalism produces, and yet it does not allow for their realization, but in fact, it blocks their realization. And so this form of, again, critique and this form of historicism seems to me to be very different from contemporary theory. And it then also highlights, and this will be the last element I wanted to highlight, so beyond kind of the theory of capitalism, it also shows that the way in which, for Marx and this tradition, critique proceeds and develops is always, even when it's describing current society, it's always with the aim of the abolition of existing society. So its methodology, its categories aim at the negation of society, not its perpetuation. So I think in this way, we can pay attention to the particular categories that, for example, in Marx, value, commodity, labor, unlike a category like, let's say, to use Butler again as an example, precarity. One category, in a sense, can unveil the structure of society and can show the historical nature of our social relations, the way in which these relations appear objective, as in Marxist terms, as relations between things, when in fact they're relations between humans. So it can show the reality of a situation, can explain mystification, and also can, in a sense, it seems to me, bring alive these social factors as indictments of society. So using these categories both to reveal the structure of society and as indictments of the present, with the aim of kind of the beyond, right? To think about the negation of society. And I think this shows that this tradition, this is something that I mentioned earlier as well, is really committed to something like total transformation. And that, I think, is also really useful from this tradition, as opposed to what we find today, which is talking about resistances, finding cracks in the system, thinking otherwise, or perpetual resistance in that which is, as opposed to emancipation from society. So it seems to me, at the level of theorizing capitalism, at the level of the historical character of theory, as well as politics and emancipation, this tradition of dialectical thinking and historical materialism is, I think, much more useful for understanding present domination and for being able to provide emancipatory theory. So you can think, for example, how, just to take, again, I keep taking Butler as a contrast, but they're really not the only one. Someone like Butler will think about domination, freedom in opposition, right? So on the one hand, you have capitalism, domination. On the other hand, you have freedom or equality that's supposed to be the anti-capitalist one. When you look at this historical materialist tradition, you'll find an analysis of these two in a dialectical relationship. Not one anti-capitalist, one capitalist, but thinking about their relationship. And I think this is where theory gets more complicated, but I think it's more useful to be able to think about these contradictions, freedom and domination, the possibility of having something like the creation of the individual and their disintegration, to use Marx's language. So to think about this dialectically, I think, is really useful and really important. And I would really highlight the historical character and immanent critique as being two really useful methodologies that this tradition of Marxism offers us.
Thank you very much. Annie, would you like to answer the same question?
Okay. So I agree with pretty much everything that Jeta said. I guess for me, the starting point is that Marx is offering us a different kind of history. And I think if you kind of start from the Grundrisse, and this was a really kind of important text of people who, in a particular moment, as this kind of Soviet account of what Marxism was, of what Leninism was, became dominant, that people who were searching for a Marxism or a socialism or a communism without the Gulag kind of turned to, you find yourself kind of seeing from Marx's vantage point that the possibility of doing history as starting from us and then projecting back out into the past with our categories, with our understanding, with our conceptions of these abstract things is a distinctive and unique feature of capitalism. So the notion that we would have, you know, as political economy emerges as a discipline, a history of labor, this abstract thing, which appears in every epoch of history as the same thing, without understanding or unpacking the content of labor, as Jeta kind of talked about, is something that is distinctively of this epoch. And I think the alternative that Marx offers to this, and this kind of mirrors in many senses Jeta's account of critique, is of history as critique, in the context of capitalism, in which our understanding of the world is so shaped by the abstract categories that we use to make sense of or make meaning in the world, then the object or the purpose of history is to demystify, is to put things in their right place. And I think that beginning to understand that allows us to kind of see how, first of all, critical theory has moved so far away, but also allows us to kind of see why it's so difficult to develop a compelling account in a society in which the abstractions of capital or ideology masquerades itself as intuition. So the things that we say seem intuitively wrong because capitalism has socialized us into certain forms of intuition. And I think that earlier on, I made a kind of reference to Stuart Hall's account of Marxism as the questions that you ask. And I think that's really the most beautiful kind of encapsulation of immanent critique that I found. If I want to study labor, if I want to study Blackness, what kinds of questions do I have to ask in order to unravel it once I hit the seams or once I get to the limit of what is possible within the frame that I'm given? And I think there's a really kind of like Socratic dimension to inquiry, Marxist inquiry, in this sense. I think there's another kind of, and this is where understanding the dynamics of the 20th century kind of comes or can be brought to bear, which is that the one second, I'm going to move, which is that the kind of concentration of, and what I found really difficult, sorry, as an aside, when I released the piece on Afro-Pessimism, was that I thought of it in a sense as a critique, not just of identity politics or Afro-Pessimism, but also of a critique of contemporary Marxism. And I sat online and I observed how many of the people who I saw myself as critiquing were using the article as a means to kind of attack or critique Afro-Pessimism. And I think there's a kind of lack of reflexiveness or self-awareness at times in contemporary Marxist circles, because we are not doing Marxism as a methodology, but rather doing Marxism as in a biblical sense, as a Bible. And we kind of like look for the things in the world that match up to it. And I think one of the kind of most evident examples of this is the search for who is the universal subject, or who's the subject of revolution. And I think the problem with that is that it's meant that we haven't been able to contend with, like I talked about earlier, the transitions that have happened in capitalism in order to kind of develop a theory that kind of works for us today. I think that the real kind of trick is that Joy James has a talk that she did last year on the commodification of revolution. And in many senses, I disagree with her, and I don't think she's necessarily coming from a Marxist perspective, but I think there's a really important kernel in what she says, where she talks about how historically the kind of university space or the student space, not just in the global in the imperial core, but also in the global periphery, have played a really important role in kind of agitation for revolution, and played a really important role in creating space or opportunities for people to kind of think the possibility of transformation. But much of that, whilst you had some professors who kind of had the freedom and the space with tenure and all of that kind of stuff to drive that or to open opportunities, much of that wasn't driven within the actual confines of the curriculum or within the actual confines of thought. And I think that as you've kind of had the elevation of a respectable form of Marxism or a respectable form of leftism into the academy, capitalism has been able to kind of dominate or kind of hegemonize itself in setting the parameters or boundaries of radical thought. And I think that's really dangerous. And I think what Marx offers to us in this account is that at the moment we have a tension, right? So you have loads of academics within the academy who are trying to think and have their boundaries set and their parameters set by the academy and by the demands of the academy. By the academy and by the demands of the academy. And then you have kind of atomized movements which are developing outside of the academy, which don't necessarily have the language. And I think Afro-Pessimism is a really good example of this, just to kind of return to that, where you have structured theory, incoherent in some senses as I think that it is, of Blackness, which bleeds out into political movements and also is fed by those political movements. And in the academy, you have, academics who get, props, who get funding, grant work, on the demonstration of impact in the real world, on popularity and social media, right? Which kind of drives a kind of increasingly populist kind of mode of thinking. At the same time, despite the fact that these languages are bleeding into movements, these movements are kind of quite suspicious of organized thought or the academy. And so it creates a kind of interesting tension in which you have both the veneer of intellectualism and a kind of virulent anti-intellectualism. And when I talk about intellectualism here, I'm not talking about the academy, I'm talking about like the precision and rigor of thought as directed towards a problem or a question or a mode of inquiry. And I think what, in a strange sense, Marx offers, which is quite beautiful, is a release from this. Because as this kind of gets tied to what I talked about earlier, which is like the role of ontology in kind of fixing particular subject positions and thinking about the relationships between those subject positions as represented by human beings as like relations of domination. Marx frees us first of all from moralism or moral critique, and also kind of frees us from the notion that fellow travelers have to necessarily look like or be like us. And I think what that offered in the 20th century was the kind of environment, if you think about South Africa, right? A Joe Slovo today. I remember a couple of years back in the UK, some white activists got arrested for blocking a deportation flight in the UK, and the reaction to them was, checking your privilege, dominating the movement, stealing the limelight, and people didn't kind of understand how this was like the use of privileges, in inverted commas, conferred upon them by society in order to put themselves in the firing line and protect people who are disempowered or more disempowered by capital. Whereas historically, from a Marxist frame, you would understand it as a social totality in which not just the worker, but also the boss and surplus labor are all dominated by the self-valorization of capital. And so it's not just that workers have an interest in revolution, or that dominated people or oppressed people have an interest in revolution because they are dominated by a particular class of people who represent capital, but actually that the role of the universal subject in Marx is to free all of us from a system or a mode of production of our own making, in which all of our domination appears to us as relations between ourselves in a kind of separate and alienated arena. And I think that analysis is really powerful, not because it allows us to kind of import that same language of the 60s, well, struggle is a global struggle, but because it gives us the building blocks to begin to think about what that kind of struggle might look like for us today.
I would also add, and I think one of the things that I found most striking, even if you, in my PhD, the final section is dedicated to Blackness as abstraction and how that emerges. And one of my chosen texts is quite, has been quite controversial, which is Black Marxism, Cedric Robinson. And my argument is, in Cedric Robinson, despite the fact that he rejects that, the notion that he's kind of advancing a biological or an essentialist account of Blackness, what he does is, on the one hand, import this notion of ontology through abstracting Blackness as a trans-historical category in which you can kind of map the spirit of Blackness, which goes through different generations, in which the revolutions or the revolutionary spirit of the 1960s, 1970s can be tied directly to the experiences on the plantation or the struggles on the slave ship. And on the other hand, what he does is he takes a whole series of Marxist thinkers who are Black, empties them of their Marxist content, and presents essentially their Marxist account as a Black account. In contrast to that, and I think it's important to say that I don't think I'm doing anything particularly new. I actually think that in my research, my primary role is a work of recovery. You have the likes of Walter Rodney. You have the likes of Walter Rodney. You have the likes of my brain's gone blank. But the author of the Black Jacobins, C.L.R. James. That's it. Who are advancing what it could look like to do this kind of theoretical work differently. What it could look like to look at a society in which Black people are dominated and to historicize and track the processes, first of all, which created Blackness in the first place, but also secondly, which allows for the perpetuation of that domination in order to identify the points of entry in which we might kind of think the possibility of something different. And I want to kind of like end, I think I may have gone over time a little bit, by zooming in with Walter Rodney on his book on the Russian Revolution. Many people don't know that he actually wrote or started writing his book on the Russian Revolution before he wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and abandoned it thinking How Europe Underdeveloped Africa was the kind of more politically urgent project. But I think that there's something really striking about his account of his account of why it was necessary to take a second look at the Russian Revolution, and in particular to take a second look at it from a Black perspective. I think we kind of come a bit full circle in that moment. If, you know, at the beginning I talked about the separation of mind and body, and I think that what Walter Rodney offers in his book, The Russian Revolution, is an opportunity to feed into that separation, but to do so by dislocating Blackness from the body as an essential component of the body, or race as an essential component of the body, and to think about it as a feature of the mind. And that kind of fits really well with kind of, if you think about Biko's account of Black consciousness as a mode of thinking Black. I think Rob Waters also wrote a book about cats who think Black. What you get is an understanding that that logic of domination in the form of proletarianization constructs on our behalf a mode of thinking about the world which enables us to see more than others do. I don't think that's essential to people of African descent or African origin, but I think it can actually be, and I did a podcast some time ago where I made the argument that, you know, thinking about Marxism as a European thing robs Black people of the role that they've had in transforming how we think about Marxism. But to separate it and say the vantage point that is given to us from the experiences that we have in society is similar also to Stokely Carmichael's account of Black power as, you know, now we understand from the position of Blackness, we have to ask ourselves, do we want to be participants in the American empire, or do we just want to kind of sharing the benefits or the spoils of imperialism and domination. And I think increasingly for me, and this is why I define myself as a Black Marxist rather than just a Marxist, that account enables us to free Blackness from its tie to the body or its tie to biology, and open it out for other people to see things through those eyes. And I think one of the kind of ending note, the actual ending note is that at the end of my essay on Afro-Pessimism, I said, if you think that the interests of white people are essentially opposed to the interests of Black people, that the interests of anyone who's not Black, the very possibility of them being human is in opposition to Black life, then you find yourself with a theory which either leads to despondence because there's nothing you can do about it, or genocidal thought, which is that to end the world as it is to destroy the other. And I think that the notion of the perfectibility of man, the notion that people can change and grow, the notion that in different conditions, the same people can exhibit different natures, really in terms of Marx's contribution is central. I'll leave it off.
Thank you so much. So now I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience. And so take, depending on if there's multiple questions, I think it'd probably be good to take a couple at a time. So go ahead and let's see, we've got, Colin, would you like to start?
Sure. Thank y'all both for your talks. They're really great and the articles are really interesting. My main question is for Jeta. It's about one of them I think you kind of already answered, which is like, but maybe you could say more about, which is where you see the Marxist critique of idealism fitting into the critique of ontology. And then the other question is about the question of where you see Marx's ideas about the general laws of history and ideas like species being fitting into this, because they seem to possibly have an ontological component. And so like in Engels, when he gives his funeral address for Marx, he says that Marx, some great people only make one great scientific discovery. Marx made two, which was the general laws of history, which is that we have to reproduce the basic conditions of our existence. And then the other was the specific laws of capitalism. So I would wonder where you'd see the idea of species being and the general laws of history fitting into this critique of ontology.
Perfect, thank you. I'm also going to take Sakshi's question, and then yeah, go ahead, Sakshi.
Hi, yeah. My question is for Annie. While I was reading the article that was prescribed to us, I constantly kept thinking about where allyship fit into all of this, in the Indian context specifically. Because when Annie also talked about Dalit Panthers and how the whole Black Panthers movement became global, and most of the oppressed groups joined in a way, I was constantly thinking about how it would fare in today's context. I think I would like to give an example for that. For example, when Dalit Panthers happened, they also, under the gambit of the term Dalit, they also included gender minorities, they also included religious minorities, they included everybody who they thought were oppressed or who thought that they could be oppressed possibly. So, but in today's day and age, people sort of think that this is a slightly more reductionist approach when it comes to like clubbing all of this together and all the oppressed identities together and not taking into consideration how the nature of oppression in certain categories is completely like distinct to one another. So what I was thinking was how do we form a transnational sort of solidarity in this sort of a context? I hope it's not a really big question, and it's not like too much. Just yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sakshi. So I'll turn it over to Annie and Jeta, and you both should feel free to reply to both of or any of the questions. Who would like to go first?
Annie, do you want to go first?
I don't mind. It's okay. Get going. Okay, so I want to steal one of Yeta's questions, and then also kind of come on to the question from Sachi. So on the question of the species being, I think there are two kind of angles to this, right? So the first is that in some senses, I don't know if ontologizing is the right word, but in some senses, we've kind of like deified Marx, in that we kind of treat everything that he says as if it has to be entirely logically consistent across time, but you have to understand that Marx is also himself in a project of inquiry. And so I think for me, the important kind of thing to note is that you have over time the development, and I think you can kind of see this in terms of the contrast of his early work to his later work, where Marx is kind of searching for language to describe some of the phenomena that he's witnessing. And over time it kind of develops into something fuller, but his project is never fully complete. I think for that reason, of course, he's not immune to ontologizing. I think that's the instinctive kind of mode of thinking under capitalism. But I think that he, over time, begins to question some of those foundational assumptions. In terms of the question on transnational solidarity, I'll kind of come out and say, I think allyship is a nonsense. I think it's a grift, and it's gotten me into a lot of trouble. But I think if you kind of take as a starting point what I said in my last answer about how all of us are dominated by capital, all of us have, people think about Marxism as having a horizon of equality. I don't actually think that's what Marx wants. I think the primary object of Marxism, or the horizon of Marxism, is freedom. And if you kind of think about his analysis, it's the ways in which capital or capitalism makes us unfree. And you can kind of think about this in a practical sense, right? The boss or the white person or any other category of people that you might think of as dominating, if they act outside of the confines, they're either punished by capitalism. So a boss who wants to pay their workers loads and loads of money is going to go out of business very quickly and lose all of their capital. White people in virulently racist societies who kind of break from the demands of rigid social orders, racist rigid social orders, are punished for it. The same way men are punished for displaying femininity, right? And so I think that what allyship does is it imports into movements the fundamental presupposition of different interests. And I think if we think from a Marxist sense that our horizon is freedom and our demand is freedom, then all of us share that interest. And I think it's beautifully encapsulated by something that Bobby Seale used to say from the Black Panther Party, where he says, the best work that we can do for revolutionaries abroad, or the best care package we can send to them, is the work that we do here at home, which is to say that no matter where you're located, sharing that horizon of freedom, our struggles to emancipate ourselves in particular historical or geographical contexts contributes to a larger whole of resistance to a common enemy, which is capitalism. And I think you can really see how this concept of allyship, whilst it appears to open the door for people into our movement, what it actually does is incapacitates at times. And I've witnessed so many times people, ironically end up shifting a lot of the responsibility and a lot of the burden and a lot of the risk of resistance onto the same people that they claim to want to be in allyship with, right? I can't be at the front because I don't want to take up too much limelight, but at the front is where the police are going to beat you. I can't, talk or articulate using the skills or the power or the access that I have because I might end up overshadowing people. And I think that what ends up happening is that, one, it prevents the coherent organization.
Oh, Annie, are you there? I think, oh, I think she just got cut off. There we go. Annie, are you back?
Jen, do you want to pivot to Jeta?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead. And I think Annie is having a internet issue. So Yeta, do you want to go ahead and reply?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Colin, so much for that question. So here I disagree with Annie. I do not think there's ontological tendencies in Marx at all. And this is, I think, how I would address the question of whether the laws of capitalism and the species being are ontological or not. The laws of capitalism, that cannot be ontological, it seems to me, precisely because he's talking about capitalism as a historically specific form of society, which has its own structure, its own tendencies, its own movement, its own contradictions, etc. Right? So the moment in which we, in a sense, agree that Marx restates this over and over and over again, I'm talking about capitalism, this particular form of society, and the laws that apply to this society do not apply to previous forms of societies. So in that sense, I cannot see how this would be ontological. The species being thing might be a bit more difficult because it has this like ring of ontology. And I think here it's really important again to bring up what I said in response to Jennifer's first question. There is a way in which, with especially it seems to me with Heidegger and on, every question about the human being, etc., is understood in ontological terms. So Heidegger and on, unlike let's say Plato, right? We wouldn't treat how Plato speaks about human beings and how Heidegger presumably talks about human beings in the same way, especially if we think about these theories in historical terms. But again, with Heidegger, it seems that on everything gets collapsed into ontology and being, such that seeing even something like species being in Marx triggers, right, the assumption that we are reading ontology. But it seems to me that Marx can use and does use abstract categories and at the same time wants to do historically specific analysis. For example, he uses a concept like labor, which is, you can say all human beings have always labored in all forms of society, but an analysis of labor would have to be historically specific. So then when he does his critique of capitalism, he's talking about a particular form of labor, even though we have this abstract category of labor as such, let's put it. And species being, it seems to me, functions in a similar way. And the other thing that I would add, which I think is really useful, is that unlike someone like Butler, who wants to do social ontology, and as I was saying earlier, collapses the distinction between society and nature, I think Marx and later generations of critical theorists can explain the formation of the human or the individual as a social determination precisely because they retain society and nature in a dialectical form. So we can talk about something, let's say, like if you're Hegelian second nature, you can talk about Marx in terms of human beings are different in different forms of society. This is how it looks like. This is a theory that retains, again, the dialectic between society and nature and does not collapse their difference. The moment in which they're collapsed, like in the case of Butler, it seems to me that everything becomes ontology, society becomes ontology, history becomes ontology. So I think Marx retains this distinction, it seems to me, on purpose, but it does not seem to be ontological. And very briefly about the question of idealism, I think there is a really close connection between these contemporary ontological tendencies and idealism. And I think about them kind of in two ways. One in terms of how thinkers like Maria Lugones or Butler as well, but to take another example, both diagnose problems and provide solutions. So very often the way in which to diagnose problems is to look at ways of seeing behaviors, attitude, beliefs, instead of social relations as having the causal agency. And when it comes to solutions, right, often they will talk about solutions in these idealist terms as well, such as in Lugones's language, identifying with the other, loving the other, etc. Right? So they have this example, which is very interesting. They talk about a servant and the servant's master. And Lugones complains, says, look how often the master of a servant will not think about how they appear in the world of the servant. And that's what they ought to do. They ought to realize that they're different in their world versus different in the world or in the eyes of the servant. And this for her is a kind of politics of identification, right? And of course, I'm assuming everyone here immediately realizes how ridiculous that is, but it is a way in which, right, from the get-go, the diagnosis is an idealist methodology, and so are the solutions as a result.
Thank you very much. I'll take a couple more questions. And also, Annie, if you want to, in responding to these, pick up on anything that you weren't able to finish when your internet cut out, you can please feel free to do that as well. But I'll take the questions from Joao and Gabriel. Joao, do you want to go first?
Sure. I thought Gabriel was ahead of me, but it's okay. Yeah, I would like to thank you very much for your writings and your talks. Very much appreciate most of things, except for this one point, if I may, because of my own studies on ontology. And I think when we're doing Marxism, we should take this concept of ontology with more care, in the sense that when I'm listening to discussion, when I read the material, I'm seeing a sort of fetishization of the concept of ontology in itself, as if the concept was a truth. In the sense, it's the very critique is becoming idealist, because what is ontology except the study of being? But Marx's critique is constantly the study of being, historically, materially, dialectically. And in this regard, we can take two contributions from George Lukács, one from Geschichte und Klassenbewusstsein, a history and class consciousness, in which he aims to the question of methodology as the central aspect of Marxism. And when I heard you talking about, both of you talking about the Marxism, this question of methodology is really was there. I'm seeing that you grasp this aspect. But when we look for the question of ontology, suddenly ontology in itself is essentialism, as if the concept was a truth in itself. But Lukács later he wrote the ontology of the social being, and when you study that work and you study Marx's work, it makes a lot of sense, because Marx is studying the being, the human as a social being, and was, as Jeta was talking about, the category of labor is indeed crucial, because he's looking from since the manuscripts of 1844 until the end, how humans as organic beings produce and reproduce life, and the mediation is not like other animals, just genetically responses in a dialectical level with the environment. Humans, through labor, they transform and shape reality, social reality, and in the sense also nature, because they are natural beings. But so to take ontology as a concept and says, no, Marxism has no ontology. Yeah, it has no ontology in the sense of being essentialist, but the very studies about ontology at this dialectical level of trying to understand humans throughout its history, but also in the particular mode of production of capitalism, and also using Marxism as a methodology, with like try to look at China and say, oh, China or Soviet Russian or Cuba, whatever socialist mode of production is going beyond capitalism. We also have to look at the particularities of these modes, and not just say, oh, now we won't use Marxism because Marxism was talking about the particularity of capitalism. So it's giving us a method, a really important method to work it with, and the ontological aspect in the sense of the social being, of the movement, of the tendencies, it's crucial, and it's not about essence. And so the concept cannot be conflated with the thing in itself. Like also, for instance, when people talk about money or the commodity, labor, as if it were a thing in itself as well. They're not. They depend on the relation, on the motion, on the practice, and the practice determines in the end what the thing is in the sense of being as movement. So yeah, just wanted to make this comment, maybe a critique. You might want to respond or not. Feel free. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Gabriel.
My question's primarily for Jeta, but it actually overlaps a lot with some of the things that Annie said. And in listening to Joao, I realized that it's also kind of pushing in a similar direction. Jeta, I was curious to hear you talk a little bit more about how your specific critiques of people like Butler and Lugones relate to a kind of larger methodological intervention insofar as what it is that you're doing, I take it, and Annie referenced this by saying that a lot of their project is a kind of return to or reconnection to earlier Marxist traditions, is very much like, so what you're doing methodologically is very similar to what the later Engels did in his criticisms of metaphysics and his juxtaposition between the methodology of dialectics on the one hand and metaphysics on the other. Metaphysics would reify things, take them as fixed, unchanging properties, etc., giving us an essentialized ontology like Joao was talking about, or for that matter, in the early 20th century, Lukács's theorization of reification, which in many ways is doing the same thing. It's demonstrating that the process of what Engels called metaphysics is actually taking place within capitalist social relations, because under capitalism, we're trained not to see relations, processes, struggle, etc., but instead to see things and to fixate on those things. And so I guess it's an invitation to hear you more about how your methodological intervention relates to long-standing struggles in the Marxist tradition to push back against culturalism, back against race-based thinking, back against reification, metaphysics, all of these methodologies that ultimately are trying to train us to apprehend the world as something that is composed of fixed and unchanging substances, rather than subjects and processes, and hence rooted in ongoing transformations that could lead in a better direction. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And I'm just going to add one more question into the mix to make sure we can get to everything. This is a question from Lucia from the chat. It's for Annie. And Lucia writes, I'd be curious to hear if the theorists of Afro-Pessimism have responded to your critique and how they may continue to defend their theoretical framework as a valuable interpretive lens. Okay, so I'll turn it over to you, Jeta and Annie, whoever would like to go first.
Well, I can start. Yeah, thank you so much, Joao, for that question. So I would say a few things, and I hope here I'm not too repetitive with a previous answer. But I think it's important. It seems to be really important to take seriously that ontology as a particular moment in the history of philosophy. It emerges at a certain time. It has certain goals. It has its own history. So I do not think it is. I want to move away from, in a sense, collapsing ontology as a particular form of doing philosophy and a particular way of talking about individuals and beings from theories that, in a sense, address something like the individual and the being. And I think we can see that there is this distinction when we also look at what happens during Heidegger's time and on, right? There is this whole debate, like think about the Frankfurt School's response to Heidegger between ontology in the Heideggerian style versus thinking about the individual as a social determination, right? They're still talking about individuals, human society, etc., right? But methodologies are different, the goals are different, the traditions are different. So it seems to me that it is important to keep this in mind. And this also, in a sense, I think should push us to think about the historical and theoretical context in which Marx is writing, right? Prior to, in a sense, what becomes ontology. So I think for this reason, I understand your kind of your worry about reifying ontology. And I think one way that we can move past that correct worry is to think of it as a theoretical development that thinks it's grasping something real when in fact it's not, and then to return to those, in a way, the real things, right? So individuals as social determinations, a form of society, social conditions, social relations, etc. So yeah, in that sense, and again, I would like make a distinction between this kind of the study of being in the traditionally essentialized way in which ontology typically does it, and Marx and the tradition that follows Marx. And Gabriel, yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, I think fundamentally, that is what is happening with this. What you use the language of reification. I think that's the correct one to talk about Butler and Lugones. And again, they're not the only ones. And I think what I find really interesting is that you do have this reification, which you correctly talked about as like talking about things, social relations as unchanging, fixed. And at the same time, a really kind of romanticization of fluidity. You have both occurring at the same time, and both of those things seem to me to be ideological reflections of late capitalism. On the one hand, you have this like insistence on an ontological account, and on the other hand, this ontological account looks like fluidity. You see this in Lugones, you see this in Butler, and then now what fluidity does, and this is again maybe something that we can in an odd way still relate to Heidegger, but I'll leave it aside, is you have a subject who in a sense is able to encompass all possibilities, and they become the subject's possibilities, right? They can resist at all times, at all places, they're fluid, a kind of, you know, divine-like character that has the ability to change from one place to another, to identify with whatever they want, etc. Right? So really a fluid subject. And in part, you can see why this tendency is coming about in response to strict, fixed hierarchies and a class structure even. But it's presented, it seems to me, in a really ideological way. So I find it really interesting that you have this kind of both an attempt to reify and to reify that which is really flexible. And this seems to, in a sense, really mimic the movement of capitalism, that you have this kind of capitalism by way of, as Marx puts it, disrupting everything existing, by way of doing that, fixing itself as an eternal, what seems like an eternal present. But yeah, I'll turn it over to Manny.
Thanks so much, Jeta. I think some of what I say is going to be maybe potentially kind of repetitive in terms of what you said. Just as a starting point on, and I think this kind of connects to the first question that we just got. In terms of species being and my comment on Marx, I don't think I was arguing that Marx has illogical tendencies. Maybe I phrased myself wrong. I guess the point is that we have a tendency when we think about Marx's thought or Marx's writing to kind of think about it as a like coherent whole rather than thinking about it of a journey of inquiry. And I think part of the problem then is that we read early writings into later writings or project early formulations into later formulations in a way that kind of empties some of the nuancing of his thinking. I think if I spoke to somebody today about my Afro-Pessimism article, my thinking has developed much further beyond that. And I have a great deal more specificity in the way that I am thinking about the role that it's playing in the political economy of Afro-Pessimism as a tradition within the academy today. And so I think that a similar thing is happening where reading Marx in the 1844 manuscripts kind of leads people to presume that the formulations that he has in the early writings are escape unscathed in the later writings. And I think that can sometimes be a mistake. And I think also that ties to how one is to think about Marx. We at times take him out of his historical context, but much of his writing is either in response to other theorists or in response to actual events in the world, right? And I think placing his writings in that context also makes it much easier to kind of see some of these nuances. And I'll add a final point on that, which is distinguishing between Marx, the theorist, and Marx, the revolutionary, in that one of, whenever I talk to people or teach on the Communist Manifesto, it's like kind of common for people to kind of say, oh, well, Communist Manifesto is a distillation of Marx's ideas about the world and about capitalism. And so that's the kind of Marxist Bible, when in reality, it's a political intervention into a particular moment, which has to be understood in that context and can't neatly be transposed onto later moments or our contemporary world. In terms of the questions themselves, I think, especially in relation to history and historicity, one of the other things that I have noticed is quite common today is to collapse distinctive traditions of thought. And one of the texts that I read quite early on at university that kind of changed my way of thinking is it's actually not Marxist by any standard of the word, but she loves Rousseau, is by one of my heroes, Carmen Abolsi, where she, it's called Traditions of War. And she's really kind of unpicking, you know, we talk about republicanism, these distinctive traditions which are formulated by different associations of thought under this banner that we put under this banner of republicanism. And I think today that happens a lot when we, for example, think about Black Power, or we think about nationalism, or we think about national liberation. There's a tendency to collapse loads of different and fiercely oppositional viewpoints, methodologies, accounts of social theory or how the world works into one discipline or one area of thought. And I don't know, I have an instinct that this is quite tied to the emergence of area studies within the academy. But the danger then is to do that work of abstraction on capital's behalf and say, they're saying the same words, so they must be doing the same thing. And a kind of neat example of this is, you know, Marx talks a lot about the economy and the categories of the economy, and he invests loads of time in engaging with Adam Smith and Ricardo. And in reality, his Capital is in opposition, a critique of what their project is, which is political economy, a critique of political economy. And so I think that in order to kind of bridge that gap of metaphysics, to think about Marx as an ontologist of a different form would require that we collapse the rejection of ontology, as Jeta says, in its historical context and what it is as a tradition, a historically specific tradition of thought. And I think that would be problematic because they're doing a very different thing. In terms of Gabriel's point, I think the debate that's happening internally, I think some of the fiercest critiques of, you know, oftentimes when I tell people I'm a Marxist, everybody will know this, that you know, the first thing is, if you're talking to somebody outside of Marxism, you know, but what about the Soviet Union and what about China and all of these kinds of things? I don't have to defend that. I don't have a stake in any of those projects because I want to find a version of freedom. I want to pursue freedom without the gulag, right? And I think that some of the fiercest critiques of those projects, many people don't realize, come from inside the Marxist tradition. As with Black Power, some of the fiercest critiques of Black nationalism come from inside Black Power. And I think that today, I talked earlier about the kind of like growing hegemony of a kind of Soviet style. I define my Marxism by certain Russian historical figures, kind of mode of approaching or engaging Marxism has become dominant. And I think that's quite tied to the practicality of organizing and the kind of composition of Marxists today who are resisting, right? We're kind of tying ourselves to different, or the invocation of Marxism is to like tie oneself to the like milieu of different movements or organizations or parties which claim that Marxist mantle. But I think the beauty of kind of breaking out of that or breaking free of that and understanding these as historically specific and understanding there as being different traditions under the banner of Marxism, is that it opens us up to so many more thinkers who are robbed from us. I think Hall, I've referenced quite a few times, he talks about himself as always being in shouting distance of Marx, which I think is quite a beautiful turn of phrase. I think, you know, I was listening to a talk from some subalternists who talked about this letter that Engels wrote to a newspaper editor, where he talks about where he talks about how, you know, kind of bending the stick, right? Marx, and the mistake that he and Marx made was to place too much emphasis on the economy and to kind of in a sense implicitly devalue other forms of political organization and resistance. And out of that comes the language of "in the last instance," which was the subject of much inquiry. And I think then you're able to see that this thing called Marxism, or this mode of thinking called Marxism, is much broader than simply people who claim fidelity to it. but also has much more capacity than people give it credit for. And I think part of the staking my flag and being a Marxist in the language of methodology or in the frame of methodology is to reclaim all of those traditions that get lost when people kind of have a fixed view of Marx's account. Final thing I will say, I get accused a lot. I remember I was asked to be on the talk, and the person, I don't know if it was professional or not, told me on the side that someone didn't want me to speak, and the reason they gave was that they thought I was a class reductionist. And I responded, well, I am a class reductionist insofar as I understand that race, gender, and all of these other dynamics and modes of understanding ourselves and differentiating ourselves within society are essential to the composition of class. There is no abstract proletarian. There is no proletarian without race, or worker without race, gender, ability, sexuality. And I think the difficulty for people, and this comes back to how ontology makes things easier for us because it helps us with sense making. The difficulty is to confront a world of so much flux, a world in which there is so much contingency, is much more challenging, is much more daunting. So yeah, I think it's about being courageous to be honest about our kind of intellectual debts in relation to Marx, but also being courageous enough to take on the task of anchoring ourselves in a theory which is constantly changing as the world changes. I'll leave that.
Thank you very much. Markella, do you want to share your question?
Yeah, thanks. This is a question for Jeta. I think interesting your discussion about ontology and Butler, and I'm wondering, you know, Butler, they have some theories of trauma, and trauma is something that I've been working on quite a bit. So I'm wondering, you know, trauma studies itself has been, as you probably know, very commodified in the academy, and it is, I suspect you would say, it's an ontologizing process. So I'm just wondering, you know, what your take is on trauma in relation to your critique of ontological practices. And there's a second question too, is that what you're talking about with the fluidity and of Butler's analysis of the fluidity that they ascribe to, it has a relationship, I think, to Deleuze and Guattari, and you know, difference and the ideas of schizophrenia and psychoanalysis. So I'm wondering also how you approach those issues in your work. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. If you want to, we can have the response to this question. Then Annie, if you also want to respond to that other question about Afro-Pessimists' response to your article. Jeta, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Markella, for this questions. So, so first, the trauma question. So it is interesting to see Butler's work, because initially, when they theorized trauma, if I understand you correctly, right, is it about the subjectivity is a kind of wound, and it is trauma in the sense not incredibly specific, and let's say the psychoanalytic or Freudian sense, but it is about this kind of that to be a subject, right, begins initially as a wound, etc., that never quite goes away. And there is, I think it's important to take seriously that there is a kind of break in Butler's work. I mean, usually it's referred to as an ethical turn. I think it's more of an ontological turn. And I've not really, so this is a really interesting question, because I've not really thought about what happens with the account of trauma once they increasingly turn to this, to the question of ontology with precariousness and precarity. So that's something I'm gonna look at, and I think it's interesting that the version of trauma that becomes popularized is not the Freudian one, and the Freudian one is interesting because it does, and I keep mentioning this, retain a kind of like dialectical relationship between the subject and society. So for Freud, when you talk about trauma, it is neither something that's caused purely by the event nor something that's caused purely by the subject. It has to be a kind of relationship between the two. So the famous example is, you know, a lot of soldiers can be exposed to the same event, but not everyone becomes traumatized. So there's something about the event, there's something about the subject, and we have to think about the relationship between the two to theorize trauma. And while this account of trauma is, I think, popular in some places, it doesn't seem to me to be the most dominant one. So I would be really interested to think more about that. So I appreciate the question. And fluidity, yeah, Deleuze is central to the kind of to the question of fluidity. And I've been looking especially at people like Braidotti, who I think is also another really good example of fluidity and influenced by Deleuze and this kind of post-structuralist feminism. And it's interesting, right? Because someone like Braidotti and the kind of feminist critique of post-structuralism initially begins with a claim of saying, you know, you have to be a privileged subject to talk about the deconstruction of the subject. Women have never really had it, so maybe like let's take a break for a second. But this critique immediately comes to a stop because people like Braidotti, right, who really are influenced by both like Derrida, Lacan, Deleuze, and other feminists following them, end up not doing away with the fluidity of the subject, but merely gendering it or sexing it. But they really retain this account of fluidity. And depending on which thinker you're reading, they can be more or less honest about what that actually means. Someone like Braidotti can be incredibly straightforward with the claims that we live in this postmodern world where everything is fluid. The best we can do is, in a sense, become fluid subjects and, in a sense, you know, create ourselves in the image of the world. But I think, yeah, but Deleuze is a really central figure there. But so is, I think, Lacan and Derrida. And it's very interesting to see how this develops, especially in the feminist tradition, who, yeah, initially found these theories of fluidity to be problematic. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Annie?
Yeah, sorry, I was posting something in the chat. I popped it in the chat, a panel I had with a few other academics who've wrote about Afro-Pessimism since mine. But so a couple of things. So the first is to the question. Actually, it's quite amusing that the journal actually reached out to Frank Wilderson after I submitted my piece to ask if he would write a response to it, and he said he wouldn't because I hadn't engaged the concept of the libidinal economy of the piece, which I think is extraneous to the target that I had. But I think since then I've had a kind of interesting journey because I've befriended some of his students who I think have a much more like nuanced account as like his thought has developed over time, and especially having worked with people like Jared Sexton, etc. And there have been a kind of few references. I remember I did a podcast about Afro-Pessimism in light of the article on Twitter, had a meltdown. I got loads of blocks. But I think that you kind of can't. Okay, so one other element of like this kind of ontological thinking is the ability to create categories of people into which people who don't have shared material experiences can define themselves. And the difficulty of that is then you, especially within the academy and in politically elite circles, attacks on or responses to or critiques of this form of ontology has like material stakes, right? So as the academy seeks to be more diverse, funding is attached, there are more opportunities, all of that kind of stuff, right? And I think that in some senses, ontology, I'll start in the developing one and move upwards to be less controversial, has allowed a kind of like masquerade of oppression in which the corrupt leaders of African countries can categorize themselves alongside their citizens who they dominate and oppress within this category of like being in the global south or being Black or being African. And you kind of like see that unfold where you have on the one hand an ethical demand on the global north to compensate for or to transform its relationship with Africa at the same time as the state in Africa becomes increasingly militarized towards, or states in Africa become increasingly militarized towards their own populations. And I think that a really good example of that historically has been the tension of Nigeria's presentation on the global stage versus locally domination in the form of like increasingly repressive policing, but also increasing militarization of entire sections of the country in response to ostensibly like threats of terror and banditry. Then in the global north, it becomes a competition, right? And I think many of these things are tied to this notion that movement should always seek to hear from or to prioritize or to advance the interests of the most oppressed in the group. And therefore being able to either define your form of oppression, Blackness in this case, as the abject position, or the composition of your oppressions as the abject position, has material stakes to it. So I think that's one of the reasons why the response was so vitriolic. Yeah, the last thing I want to say was on the fluidity question. I think there's also a sense in which the kind of stagnant account of Marx's critique of capitalism leads us to misunderstand changes within capital as like changes to capital as the mode of production. And as capital has transformed, it's always a kind of rush to present it as an entirely new thing. And I think that this is where the increasingly like diffuse nature of power and the incoherent, I think that diffusion is better kind of characterized as the increasing diversity of the political class or the empowered classes, kind of lends itself towards, on the one hand, in the kind of pathogen sense, the characterization of anyone with power as fundamentally bad, and on the other hand, the kind of valorization of powerlessness, of like fluidity. And I think that valorization of powerlessness comes with a refusal to put a flag in the ground or stake a claim to a particular subject position or a particular set of demands. And I think that can be quite dangerous for resistance. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you both so much. We have one more question that was put in the chat, if you don't mind just answering one more. This is a question from Shin that's asked that they'd be interested in both of your thoughts about mediations of the ontological construct that is or is not possible from outside of capitalism. Also, they add, for Annie, how do you find the idea of Afro-Pessimism and the affective aspect of the term is in conversation with Lauren Berlant's work or just the affective trend in today's readings of Marxism?
I'll let Annie go first.
Yeah. So I think to the first question, I think the answer would be that I don't know. I don't think any of us kind of know if it would be possible in what forms. And I think one of the kind of, glib readings of Marxism is as like an account of what society, or utopianism, right? And I think if you kind of take it as methodology rather than a framework for a new society, or as a set of analyses of this society, I think it's important to kind of acknowledge that we can't know what is possible outside of society, or what is possible outside of capitalism, or what is possible beyond capitalism. I think at the moment our horizon can only be the end of capitalism, or the kind of fleshing out, or the depth of our horizon can only be the end of capitalism. In terms of Afro-Pessimism and affect, I think one of the things that I find interesting is when I first So Afro-Pessimism was beginning to structure how people were engaging in movements. There was a profound anti-solidaristic tendency, which was emerging, especially in struggles around race. And then after the article, a lot of people who initially kind of were really vitriolic about it turned around to kind of make the claim, and Frank Wilderson is doing this now, to say, oh, no. Afro-pessimism isn't telling you what to do in the world. Afro-pessimism isn't offering a framework for resistance in the world. All we're doing is engaging with the ontology or the psychology, in a sense, of race, right? And I think there is it kind of makes it a moving target, because if you are thinking entirely within the frame of capitalism and paying attention or a particular care to understanding the role of the American academy in like hegemonizing ideas and the increasing Americanization of conceptions of race globally, then within that frame, how we think about Blackness or how we think about race, it seems to make sense intuitively, right? But I think the danger of that is that we kind of get so tangled up in knots, and that the bleeding of that theory makes it impossible, first of all, makes it difficult, first of all, to target the way things actually are, so the materiality, but also it fixes the possibility of those things changing at all. And I think it kind of makes an account of the impossibility of those things changing at all. And I think also, as time has gone on, it's become much clearer to me that so much of it is tied to, or the intuition of it is tied to, the depth of how people feel they are treated as a consequence of their race, right? And so in this account, the microaggression takes precedence over the kind of like mass exploitation of labor in the global South, or takes precedence over protecting people from microaggressions takes precedence over supporting strikes, as happened last year in the UK, or protecting people from a really good example of this was recently, where you had I don't know if people know Motaz, who's a journalist who's become very kind of popular in light of the Israelis' onslaught on Gaza. And there was a moment where Twitter had a meltdown because he kind of made an off-color joke about Sudanese people. And in that frame, you can kind of see how the priority that's given to the affect of race kind of offers opportunities to shut down movements, to shut down solidarity, and moves us away from a kind of like grounded and material account of where power concretely lies and how harm is concretely done. Yeah, I'll leave that.
Thank you, Jeta.
Okay, I'll keep it very brief. I know we're out of time. So I'll just very briefly say that I think I agree with Annie. I think it's important not to theorize the future in terms of the present, and to be careful in a sense about what we're dragging from bourgeois society into our conceptions of future society. This is the critique, for example, that Marx develops with regard to equality in the famous Gotha program. So I think, but I do think that it is important to also think, and I've been thinking about this a lot, what Adorno in his critique of ontology says, it serves a need, right? We ought to think about it symptomatically. And I think that's an important insight. And we have to do the same now and think about what is the need that ontology is serving beyond what is usually referred to as a kind of like ontological like security. I think there's something more going on. And to think about that, we might be able, in a sense, to get at the real core of why people turn to ontology, and there might be, in a sense, a kind of a truth moment that we can say, or a redemptive aspect, right, to use Benjamin's language, that we might say then can be something carried through in a different kind of society, but not ontology in the form that we know it now. But nonetheless, it does seem to serve a kind of need, and I think it's important to figure out what that is, and kind of in the Marxist sense, right, we can critique, but also we ought to be able to explain these tendencies, right, not just to simply say that they are incorrect. And I think Marx gives us the tools to do both.
Thank you so much. Annie, did you want to add something? I saw your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I was just that last comment from Jeta really kind of brought something to the front of my mind, which is this concept which has become more important to me of like the palimpsest of the afterlives or the traces of kind of previous epochs that continue into new ones. And I think one of the really important kind of roles of anti-imperialist analysis in the Marxist tradition was to kind of confront this notion that there was like an historical period in which there was like primitive accumulation and like domination and brutality and violence, and then we kind of move into capitalism where everybody's subsumed by wage slavery, and say, well, actually no, slavery and colonialism and imperialism are incredibly important to the development and the sustenance of capital, and those forms of primitive accumulation and enclosure, all of that kind of stuff in the global south are central to the capacity for capitalism to resolve its own crises, right? And I think that the challenge is when you kind of think about separate epochs, is that abstraction leads us to kind of say, well, this thing that existed then still exists today, or this thing that existed then has a formulation in today's world, and therefore to treat it as a continuity rather than to kind of think of it as like a palimpsest where got new writing, but under it there's the kind of like fades of or echoes of the previous world.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, both Jeta and Annie. This was wonderful to hear you. And thank you all for the excellent questions. I will be sure to put in the kind of shared Google Drive references and any other relevant texts from today's session. So thank you very much again.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for the questions. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. It was really great. Thank you. And thank you, Jeta and Jennifer and Gabriel for bringing me.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.